I think the United States has got a very long history of being extremely good at telling stories. And I think it's been accepted around the world that the United States, through Hollywood and through its dominant media systems, we defer to them to do that. We allow them to provide those stories. I mean, I think there's something interesting about the representation of Russia, for example. Over the last 20 years in particular, you could name countless films, but even recent TV series like 24 and Homeland and Stranger Things, all using Russian villains on a constant basis. I mean, are there any films that you can think of in which there isn't a vodka-soaked Russian thug or a dictator? Or, So there's a real mood music constantly of Russia being this implacable foe, and that their leaders just simply cannot be negotiated with.
Despite the fact, sorry to interrupt, that Russia helped to save Britain's ass during World War II.
Of course, yeah, and Russia is often airbrushed out of World War II histories, at least the popular histories. And so it means that we're set up with this situation where culturally we see Russia almost, we don't really associate Russia so much with, the ballet. We associate Russia with these horrible political and military acts. And of course, all great powers do horrible military acts, as Russia has, but it's a very dangerous situation where we have culturally the idea that that Putin, the Russian government, and the Russian state as a whole is simply, there's nothing we can do about it except for to attack and repel them purely by force. It means that we can never really, until we get over that as societies, we can never really enter into a discussion about what the future is going to be of Europe, of Ukraine, short of just two or many different blocks smashing together, and there's going to be an explosion there, and with no real, there's going to have to be a very clear loser.
Alexander, all of that was explicable when Russia was part of what was, for a time, an existential threat to the capitalist way of life. When the Soviet Union commanded a huge land mass and a big ideological following in almost all countries. But Russia is now a capitalist country. Moreover, a Christian capitalist country. Why do they hate it so much?
Why indeed? Well, I think it's not just Russia, and I think before we discuss that, there's a few points I want to make, which is that we mustn't underestimate how radical the change in America's relations with Europe we are now seeing. Historically, during the Cold War, the United States consolidated its bloc in Europe by allowing the Europeans a fair degree of political space and by ensuring that Europeans had higher living standards, material living standards, than the other side. Now, what we are seeing, and it's entirely concerted, is a steady attempt to restrict both that political space and also sacrificing European living standards. So if you go back to the Iraq War, which of course you know incredibly well, Schroeder and Chirac, leaders of Germany and France, opposed the United States over the Iraq War. You go back further, Margaret Thatcher opposed American attempts to build gas pipelines between the Soviet Union and Germany. She was opposed to the Americans. She was actually supporting these pipelines. Go back further still, you have de Gaulle speaking out against the Vietnam War. All of that has ended. The United States no longer tolerates political leaders in Europe who speak out in that fashion. And one has to say this isn't just that the political leaders in Europe have changed. Of course they have. But this hasn't happened by itself. You can see that in the media as well. The media, every year it becomes more restricted. Every year social media in Europe becomes more restricted. The window of political debate is getting narrower all the time.
Reverend, Alexander mentioned that Russia makes its own political choices, and that's difficult for the US to accept. Wasn't one of the most significant of those the decision not to allow the Syrian government and its capital, Damascus, to fall to the dark forces of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the alphabet soup of Islamist extremism. Wasn't Russia coming to the defense of Syria unpardonable in Washington?
Yes, that is another sort of move in this geopolitical sphere. Russia's support of the Damascus government did cross the United States a great deal. How dare they interfere in our backyard? I think that Russia played a very positive role there by confronting these extreme forces, which represent only a small section of Islam, by using some of local malcontents and so on. But that is part of this geopolitical. So, but I think you got to come down to reality, to realism here. We got to defend the rights of people see the rights of Europeans, and I want to freeze to death. And America, who was the late lamented Colonel Gaddafi, said America's number one enemy of humanity. Now, I don't agree with that. I think America is probably number 3 world enemy of humanity. And I'm not going to mention who the first 2 are.
What a great pity. That would be a scoop, I think.
Yeah, I will be in trouble.
Matthew, I'm trying to get at why they hate Russia so. Isn't it the key point that Alexander made, that 2 key points? One, that Russia makes its own decisions. It does not accept orders from the United States. And 2, its ever closer relationship with China. I mean, China and Russia are now effectively one country, economically speaking, certainly. Militarily, undoubtedly, if pushed too far. And therefore, we see looming into view, don't we, what Orwell wrote about in 1984, a permanent state of we have always been at war with East Asia. Is that the future that we look forward to, if that's the word?
Well, we've certainly come from a bipolar world of 2 great powers in the Cold War to arguably a unipolar world in which the United States was the key power, where it hit that in, say, the late 1990s. And now we're in a multipolar world. And a multipolar world, just because it sounds more democratic and power is more diffuse, is not more stable than either of those 2. Whether that is the same as Orwell's 3 great powers constantly trying to jostle with each other, I'm not sure if we'll quite get to that stage. I would say another thing about the reason why the populations of the West are struggling to conceptualize an idea of coming out of this, or to strengthen their opposition to the United States, I think is also about cultural attitudes towards nuclear weapons. Because I think it was very, very clear during the Cold War that nuclear weapons were completely unusable, they mustn't be used, they're extremely frightening, and that they were a major problem. And now I think the last 30 years that has just gone away. And so I think, and what's filled that gap is all sorts of crazy, I wouldn't necessarily call them conspiracy theories, but I do see around a lot people saying, well, maybe Putin will use a nuclear weapon, but then if he does, his military will assassinate him, or India will sort it out, or something. All sorts of crazy ideas are coming into this vacuum due to the ignorance, widespread ignorance, about how nuclear wars are fought. And we know from the way that all of the war games have ever been plotted that the use of one nuclear weapon is extraordinarily likely to lead to absolute devastation.
Armageddon, as Joe Biden put it. It's true, Alexander. You and I are of an age that we remember the 1980s, the sighting of cruise Pershing missiles here, a huge uprising of CND, mass demonstrations all over Europe. None of that seems to exist anymore.
Not only that, but the party in Germany, which was most associated with opposition to cruise and Pershing missiles, which was the Greens, is now the most belligerent party in Germany. It's the party that is leading, if you like, the crusade in Germany and indeed in Europe against Russia, which wants to sort of heighten this confrontation to an extraordinary degree. Now, you talked about conspiracy theories at the beginning of the programme, and in fact, the point to understand about conspiracy theories is that they are theories about conspiracies, and anybody who has spent any time working, and I used to be a lawyer in my previous life, conspiracies do exist. They actually happen in real life. Now, not every conspiracy theory is rational, but some, you know, they do happen. Now, I find it very difficult to understand how a party like the Greens could have changed its position so completely. I remember the leaders of the Greens in the late 1970s and early 1980s, people like Petra Kelly and General Bastian, her partner, and they would never have countenanced the policies we see from the Greens today. So it seems to me that there is a concerted effort, and has been a concerted effort, to close down again memories of nuclear weapons, the Hiroshima, Nagasaki, which we used to talk about all the time in the Cold War. CND, which used to be this enormous movement, has disappeared.
I can fill in some blanks on that, because literally in the documentary that we've been doing, one of the sections we have is about how the Department of Defense PR department has deliberately and quite extensively excised any reference to nuclear weapons or problems with nuclear weapons in films going back decades. Includes in films like Godzilla, for example. Godzilla was always, as a franchise, as a story, was a critique of the use of nuclear weapons on Japan. But now by 2014 and other films around using the same characters, it's now nuclear weapons are, you know, they're a really good thing. They're used to, you know, to try and destroy the monster. They're, you know, they're not actually part of the problem. They're part of a solution.
Yeah.
An extraordinary business. Final word to you, Reverend. Of course, as Alexander puts it, the Greens, the Social Democrats, the Labourites, the so-called liberals and socialists with a small s, have all become the war party.
Yes,
Can I speculate that you hope that the new right-wing Prime Minister of Italy might actually be an unexpected hope?
Well, I agree that they have become the war party, especially in this country, under Starmer, the Labour Party. Absolutely despicable. It's interesting, a point about the Greens in Germany, a betrayal of their heritage. Let's not make too much of the Meloni government. She represents a little potential for breaking this pestilent consensus over Ukraine. But I would not say that it's beginning of the end. No, I'm afraid not. And incidentally, a point about nuclear weapons. Since in the last, the Americans have fought two wars, which they've lost, Vietnam and Afghanistan, and they never dreamt of using nuclear weapons. So you can have nuclear weapons, doesn't mean you have to use them.
Well, they lost two. Maybe they think the Ukraine is third time lucky. It doesn't look like that on the battlefield, but that in itself is perhaps more dangerous.
Yeah. Can I make a point here? Because I have to disagree with you on one thing.
Please do.
The United States, twice since the end of the Second World War, has seriously considered using nuclear weapons in an armed conflict.
But MacArthur in South Korea, yes.
In Korea.
As stopped by Truman.
And in fact, Eisenhower apparently pushed for the armistice agreement that was made. He actually told the Soviets that, you know, if this doesn't happen, the possibility of the US using nuclear weapons in Korea is a real one. But the other occasion, less well known, but thoroughly documented, was in 1968 during the Vietnam War, when there was a US military base called Khe Sanh, which had been surrounded. And the US military, General Westmoreland, who was the commander, did undoubtedly consider using tactical nuclear weapons in that particular battle.